This podcast is solely for the attention of institutional, professional, qualified, or sophisticated investors and distributors.
Hi everyone. Recently we talked in this podcast about the economic consequences of floods. Today we're going to stay on the theme of water, and in particular we're going to talk about pollution caused by maritime transport. The oceans play a very big role in the global economy, given that more than 90% of global trade is transported by sea. It is generally estimated that shipping is responsible for 3% of global greenhouse gases emissions, and the Working Group on Mitigating the Causes of Climate Change, in the latest IPCC report, explicitly mentions that the maritime transport sector has a great deal of decarbonization work to do and highlights the possible solutions of hydrogen, ammonia and biofuels. In Europe, the European Commission's Fit for 55 project plans to include maritime transport in the emissions trading scheme in order to gradually reduce its emissions. This reform failed in the European Parliament at the beginning of June 2022, but has a good chance of eventually succeeding. It must be said that environmental standards remain much lower for maritime transport than for other forms of transport. For example, until 2008, the maximum sulfur content for marine fuel along the US coast was 3,500 times higher than for car fuel. This type of pollution, generated by cargo ships in particular, is responsible for very poor air quality, not only in ports but also in coastal areas. A large part of the population is concerned, since in the case of the US, half of the population lives less than 200 kilometers away from an area with heavy maritime traffic. One of the reluctances sometimes expressed about the tightening of environmental standards for maritime transport is that the consequences of this pollution on public health are uncertain or in any case difficult to measure. Low sulfur fuels cost 30 to 50% more, and the questions has sometimes been asked whether this additional financial cost for transporters translates into a real gain in terms of public health. So precisely, an NBER working paper published in June 2022 measured the consequences of the tightening of environmental standards for maritime transport, which were decided during the 2010 decade in the US. In August 2012, the US government set up emission control areas in coordination with the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, a body of the United Nations. This regulation forced cargo ships to use fuels with a low sulfur concentration within 200 nautical miles of the US coast. These restrictions on sulfur concentration were further tightened in 2015. It should be noted here that some states, such as California, played a pioneering role by imposing more restrictive standards earlier than at the federal level. So these researchers came to several interesting conclusions. This regulation tightening has reduced the concentration of fine particle matter by 4% in coastal areas when weighted by population. It has also reduced the proportion of low birth weight infants and even led to a 3.5% reduction in infant mortality. According to the estimates of these researchers, this regulation tightening would have led to approximately 300 fewer deaths at birth each year in the US coastal areas. Clearly, the question of the environmental impact of maritime transport, which had not really been at the heart of attention in recent decades, is becoming central. In the near future, environmental standards should be increasingly tightened, in particular in order to drastically reduce greenhouse gases emissions. A real metamorphosis of maritime transport should therefore take place in the coming years, most likely with the implementation of new technologies, such as the use of hydrogen. Thank you for listening and talk to you soon.
All comments and analysis reflect CPR AM views on market conditions and its evolution, according to information known at the time. As a result of the simplified nature of the information contained in this document, that information is necessarily partial and incomplete.